The email arrived on a Tuesday in late October, its subject line jarringly casual against the backdrop of my mundane inbox. Found your brother's camera. 5 years had passed since David disappeared in Hallow Ridge Forest. 5 years of searching, of police investigations that slowly dwindle from active, the cold of my parents' grief crystallizing into something permanent and unmovable. David had gone hiking alone, something he'd done countless times before, but this time he never returned. The email was from someone named Morris Thorne, claiming to be a forest ranger who discovered David's camera while clearing brush in a remote section of Hallow Ridge. No memory card inside, but my brother's name was engraved on the bottom, a gift from our parents when he'd started his photography business. If you want to collect it, Morris wrote, I'll be at the Pinewood Ranger Station this weekend. It's the least traveled entrance to Hallow Ridge. I work alone out there most days. Something felt off about the message, the terse wording, the insistence I come to this specific, isolated location, but I couldn't ignore it. After 5 years without answers, even the smallest connection to David felt magnetic. I didn't tell my parents. They'd moved across the country 2 years ago, unable to live in the shadow of the forest that had swallowed their son. I didn't tell anyone. Actually, looking back, that was my first mistake. The drive to Hallow Ridge took for hours, the last 30 minutes on a narrow road that twisted through increasingly dense pine forest. The late October sky hung low and gray, the trees on either side growing taller and closer together with each passing mile. Pinewood Station wasn't on any of my GPS maps. I followed Morris's handwritten directions, turning onto an unmarked gravel road that deteriorated quickly into little more than a rough trail. My car shuddered over exposed roots and deep ruts until I reached a small clearing with a weathered cabin at its edge. No other vehicles were visible. No welcoming smoke from the chimney. Just an overwhelming silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I checked my phone, no signal, as expected. The ranger station looked nothing like the official facilities I had visited during the initial search for David. This place appeared abandoned, with boarded windows and a sagging porch. The only indication I was in the right place was a faded wooden sign, Pinewood Station, Hallow Ridge Forest Service. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt wrong to thick, somehow both damp and dusty. The forest around me was unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing but the occasional whisper of wind through pine needles. I called out for Morris, no answer. After knocking repeatedly on the cabin door with no response, I tested the handle, unlocked. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew and something else, something acrid, that caught in my throat. A single desk sat in the corner, its surface covered with yellowed maps and what appeared to be old incident reports. A kerosene lamp stood unlit beside a logbook opened to a blank page. No sign of David's camera, no sign of Morris Thorne. What I did find pinned to the wall behind the desk was a map of Hallow Ridge with a location circled in red. Beside it, handwritten in the margins, where the cameras go. Where they all go, I should have left then. Should have driven back to civilization and contacted the police. Instead, I pulled out my phone and photographed the map, noting the marked location was approximately 3 miles from the station deep in the heart of the forest. David's camera was there. I was certain of it. The trail leading from Pinewood Station was barely visible, more suggestion than path. A slight depression in the forest floor occasionally marked by a faded blue ribbon tied to a branch. I followed it with my brother's old compass and the photographed map, watching the afternoon light fade as I ventured deeper. 2 miles in, I began noticing peculiarities. Trees with bark stripped in perfect rectangles. Small clearings where nothing grew, not even moss or lichen, the soil blackened as if burned. And cairns, dozens of them, small stacks of stones that seemed to multiply as I continued, always visible from the path, but never directly on it. The silence had given way to sound, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Whine without moving branches, footsteps that stopped when I stopped, and voices distant, indistinct, like a conversation carried from very far away. As dusk approached, the forest transformed. Shadows lengthen and multiply, stretching in directions that didn't match the angle of the fading sun. I switched on my flashlight, but its beam seemed swallowed by the darkness rather than cutting through it. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily, settling in a different direction each time. The map made less sense with each passing minute. Landmark I should have reached long ago, nowhere to be found. I was lost, not in the usual sense. I knew exactly where I was. I was in Hollow Ridge Forest, the same forest that had taken David, but something about this place defied normal navigation, as if the trees themselves moved when I wasn't looking. Night fell completely, and with it came the fog-thick, low-hanging mist that reflected my flashlight beam back at me in disorienting bursts. I decided to make camp, having come prepared with basic supplies. As I set up my small tent in a clearing, I noticed something strange about the ground. Perfectly circular indentations every few feet, each about the size of a dinner plate. Inside my tent, I reviewed the photos on my phone, the map, the strange markings I'd documented along the way. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background of one photo, partially hidden behind a tree some distance from the trail, was a figure. I zoomed in, my hands trembling. The image was grainy when enlarged, but unmistakable. A person standing unnaturally still, their face obscured not by shadow, but by what appeared to be static, like visual interference. I hadn't seen anyone during my hike, hadn't heard anyone following me, but there they were, watching from the trees. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by sounds just outside my tent, snapping twigs, rustling fabric, and once, unmistakably, the mechanical click and whir of a camera shutter. Dawn broke reluctantly through the fog, gray light filtering through the trees with all the warmth of a fluorescent bulb. I packed quickly, eager to leave, but still determined to reach the marked location. According to my calculations, it was less than a mile away now. The path, such as it was, descended into a ravine where the trees grew so densely that branches interlocked overhead, creating a natural tunnel. The ground became soft and yielding, my boots sinking slightly with each step. I noticed tree roots breaking the surface, not the usual chaotic sprawl of natural growth, but organized patterns, almost geometric in their precision. The air grew colder as I descended, despite the morning sun that should have been warming the forest. My breath clouded before me, and frost began to form on the surrounding vegetation. In late October, cold wasn't unusual, but this was different, localized, as if I'd stepped into a pocket of winter. That's when I found the first camera. It hung from a branch at eye level, an old film model similar to David's, its lens cracked and body weather-worn. A few yards further, another, this one newer, digital, its display shattered but power light still blinking weakly. I continued forward, and the cameras multiplied, dozens of them hanging from branches, half buried in the soft earth, arranged in deliberate circles around tree trunks. Some ancient, some modern, some so damaged they were barely recognizable. All pointed inward toward the path I walked. The fog thickened until visibility dropped to mere feet in any direction. I navigated by the cameras now, following their mechanical gaze toward what I knew must be the center of the marked area on Morris's map. The ground sloped sharply downward, and I half-walked, half-slid down an embankment into a perfectly circular clearing approximately 50 feet in diameter. The fog hung at its edges but didn't enter, as if repelled by some invisible barrier. In the center of the clearing stood a single object, a wooden tripod, weathered by years of exposure, but still upright. No camera mounted on it, just the empty platform, waiting. Around the tripod, the earth was disturbed in long, channel-like depressions radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Some instinct told me they were too straight, too purposeful to be natural erosion. I approached the tripod slowly, my skin prickling with the certainty that I was being watched not just by the cameras in the trees, but by something else, something that had drawn me here with the promise of answers about David. A weathered leather journal sat at the base of the tripod. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to discover it was a ranger's log. The earliest entries dated back to 1978, the handwriting changing every few years as different rangers took over the position. The entries were mundane at first, notes about trail maintenance, wildlife sightings, weather patterns. Then, in 1987, the tone changed. The ranger, someone named Harkins, reported finding another camera, had expressed confusion about hikers leaving their equipment behind. By 1992, a new ranger documented finding cameras weekly, all damaged, all missing memory cards or film. The entries grew increasingly disturbed over the years. Reports of moving shadows and faces in the fog, descriptions of hikers who couldn't be found despite extensive searches, of strange sounds recorded by the ranger station's equipment. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks ago, signed by Morris Thorne. Found camera number 172 today. Like the others, engraved with owner's name, David Chen. Brother is photographer too. Perfect candidate, sending email tomorrow. My blood went cold. David hadn't been a photographer. By trade he'd been an accountant who enjoyed hiking and casual photography. I was the photographer in the family. Morris had lured me here deliberately, knowing this connection. As I processed this revelation, I became aware of movement at the edge of the clearing. The fog was changing, condensing into shapes, human-like forms that remained just translucent enough that I could see the trees behind them. They stepped into the clearing, these figures of mist, their features indistinct except for their eyes dark, solid voids in their fog-formed faces. They moved with unnatural grace, circling the clearing, I counted 7 of them, each stopping at the end of one of the channel-like depressions in the earth. As they stood there, the fog that formed their bodies began to flow downward, pouring into the channels, flowing toward the center, toward the tripod, toward me. I backed away, but found myself unable to move beyond a certain point, as if an invisible wall had formed behind me. The fog figures remained at the edge of the clearing. With their essence, their substance flowed steadily inward through the earthen channels. Where the streams of fog met at the center, they began to rise, coalescing into a new shape around the tripod. A human silhouette formed piece by piece, first legs planted firmly on the ground, then torso, arms, and finally a head. Details emerged slowly, clothing materializing out of the swirling mist, features sharpening, colors bleeding into what had been only gray. I recognized the flannel shirt, first of blue and green pattern I'd given David for his birthday the year he disappeared. The figure that stood before me was my brother, exactly as he'd looked 5 years ago, down to the small scar above his eyebrow from a childhood fall. But his eyes were wrong flat, without depth, like photographs of eyes rather than the real thing. David, my voice broke on his name. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach those paper flat eyes. When he spoke, his voice had an echo, as if multiple people were speaking in imperfect unison. Not exactly, he said. David contributed. But I am ... more. We are more. What happened to my brother? I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. The thing wearing David's face gestured to the cameras hanging in the trees. He saw too much, they all did. This place doesn't like being seen, being captured. It takes the watchers and makes them part of the watching. I thought of the fog figures at the clearing's edge, their dark, hungry eyes, former hikers, photographers, rangers who'd investigated too deeply. What do you want from me? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. The false David held out his hand. In it was a camera, my camera, which I suddenly realized was no longer hanging around my neck where it had been throughout my hike. We need someone to take the pictures from inside, he said. Someone who understands composition, perspective. Your brother couldn't do it properly. His images were ... inadequate, but yours won't be, and if I refuse? The smile widened, stretching beyond what a human face should allow. No one refuses. You're already here. You've been taking pictures since you arrived, documenting your journey. We've been watching through your lens. With horror, I realized it was true. I'd taken dozens of photos along the trail, compulsively documenting the strange cairns, the unusual tree markings, the figure I'd spotted in the background. The clearing darkened suddenly, as if the sun had been blotted out. The fog figures at the perimeter began to move forward, no longer tethered to their channels in the earth. It's time to take your place, the thing that wasn't, David said. Behind the camera or in front of it, your choice. My mind raced. There had to be a way out, something the others had missed. I thought of the ranger's log, of the years of documented disappearances. What pattern had I missed? Then it hit me, every missing person had been a photographer or had a camera. The forest didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be captured. I raised my camera, pointing it directly at the false David. His expression flickered with something like satisfaction. Instead of taking a picture, I opened the back of the camera and ripped out the memory card, then pulled out my phone and started deleting every image I'd taken in the forest. No, the cry came not just from the David thing, but from all around, the fog figures convulsing as if in pain. You want to be seen, but only on your terms, I said, continuing to delete photos. You need the watchers, but you also need to control what they see. The clearing began to warp, trees bending inward, the ground rippling like disturbed water. The fog figures stretched and distorted, their forms becoming less human with each deleted image. I took a desperate gamble, raising my now big camera and pretending to take pictures of everything: the tripod, the channels in the earth, the fog figures, and finally, the thing wearing my brother's face. I see you, I said, the words feeling like an incantation. I see what you really are, and I'm not capturing it. No one will ever see these images. The false David's face contorted with rage, his features melting and reforming. You can't leave, he hissed, voice now completely inhuman. No one leaves the hollow woods. Watch me, I said, backing toward the edge of the clearing. The invisible barrier that had blocked me earlier was gone, dissolved with the forest's waning power. The fog figures lunged toward me, but their movements were sluggish, their forms increasingly insubstantial. I ran uphill away from the clearing, no longer following any path, but simply moving away from the center. The forest fought back, branches reaching like arms, roots rising to trip me, the very air thickening to slow my progress. Behind me, an inhuman howl rose from the clearing, a sound of such rage and hunger that it seemed to shake the earth. I didn't look back, didn't stop, even as my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back. The forest seemed to shift around me, distances compressing and the expanding logically. One moment the trees were pressing in on all sides. The next, I broke through the tree line and saw my car parked in front of the abandoned ranger station. That was 3 weeks ago. I went to the police, of course, showed them my empty camera, my phone with its deleted photos, told them about Morris Thorne and the ranger station and the clearing filled with cameras. They found no record of a Morris Thorne ever working for the Forest Service. When they accompanied me back to where I claimed Pinewood Station stood, we found nothing but dense forest, no clearing, no cabin. The official rangers insisted there had never been an outpost at that location. I convinced them to search for the camera clearing, using my memory and what remained of Morris's directions. After a day of fruitless hiking, the search was called off. One officer suggested gently that grief can sometimes manifest as vivid hallucinations. But I know what I saw, know what I escaped. Since returning, I've been researching Hollow Ridge Forest more deeply. The pattern of disappearances stretches back further than I imagined, nearly a century of missing hikers, photographers, rangers, always with the same elements: a solitary journey, a camera, a body never recovered. I've also noticed something else, something that chills me more than anything I experienced in those woods. In every photo I take now, regardless of subject or location, there's a distortion, a small area of fog in the corner of the frame. Sometimes, if the light hits just right, I can make out eyes within that fog. Yesterday, I received another email. No subject line, no signature, just 5 words. You took something from us. I'm sharing this story not as a campfire tale or creepypasta, but as a warning. If you hike in Hollow Ridge Forest, if you hike in any forest and field, that peculiar silence descend, that sense of being watched from between the trees, do not raise your camera. Do not try to capture what watches you, because in the hollow woods there are things that want to be seen just long enough to see you back. And once they've seen you through your own lens, they never stop watching. The memory card from David's camera arrived in the mail this morning. I haven't looked at what's on it yet. Part of me says to destroy it without viewing the images. Another part needs to know what my brother saw in his final moments. The card sits on my desk as I write this, next to my camera, with its lens cap firmly in place. Sometimes I think I see the cap move slightly, as if nudged from within. I won't be taking any more pictures, but I fear something is already developing in the dark room of the hollow woods. Images of me, of my home, of my life outside the forest, because the most terrifying truth I've come to realize is this: I may have escaped the clearing, but I never truly left the forest. It followed me home, and it's still watching. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my grandfather's funeral. The return address was from Blackwood, a small town I'd never heard of, nestled somewhere in the Appalachian foothills. The sender, Hargrove and Sons, attorneys at law. Dear Mr. Ellis, it began in formal typeface. It is our duty to inform you that as the sole surviving heir of Elijah Marshall, you have inherited his property and all assets therein, including the forest land known locally as Marshall's Acre. I'd barely known my grandfather. My mother had cut ties with him long before I was born, refusing to discuss him except to say he was not right. When he died at 94, I attended the funeral out of respect for the dead rather than any personal connection. Now, apparently, I owned a piece of forest I'd never seen. The letter continued with directions to the law office in Blackwood, where I would receive the deed and keys to a cabin that, according to the attorney, had been maintained in anticipation of your inheritance. My life in the city had grown stagnant, a dead-end graphic design job, a recently ended 5-year relationship, and a growing sense that I was simply occupying space rather than living in it. The inheritance felt like an opportunity, or at least a distraction. I packed a bag, told my boss I needed personal leave, and drove 8 hours into increasingly rural country until I reached Blackwood. Population 1,843 according to the weathered welcome sign. The town was a single main street lined with buildings that hadn't been updated since the 1950s, surrounded by modest homes and, beyond them, dense forest that pressed against the town's edges like a living wall. Hargrove and Sons occupied the second floor above the town's only pharmacy. Mr. Hargrove himself was a thin man in his 70s with liver-spotted hands and eyes that seemed too young for his weathered face. Your grandfather was an unusual man, he said as he slid the deed across his desk, brilliant in his way, a botanist by training, though he hadn't published in academic circles for decades. My mother never spoke of him, I admitted. Something flickered across Hargrove's face, concern, pity, yes, well. Elijah became quite reclusive after your grandmother died, dedicated himself entirely to his research on the forest. Is forest your forest now? Hargrove removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. 40 acres of old, growth surrounded by national forest land. One of the few remaining private holdings in the area, he placed a heavy iron key on top of the deed. The cabin has electricity, but no phone line. Cell service is spotty, best. Elijah preferred isolation for his work. What exactly was his work? I asked. Hargrove replaced his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. I'm afraid I can't say. Client confidentiality extends beyond death. He paused. Though you'll find his journals in the cabin. Everything is exactly as he left it, as I gathered the deed and key. Hargrove placed a hand on my arm. A word of advice, Mr. Ellis, the locals have superstitions about martial soccer. You may hear things in town. I'd suggest you not put much stock in them. What kind of things? Folklore? Nothing more. His grip tightened briefly. But perhaps don't linger in the forest after dark. At least not until you've gotten your bearings. The directions to the property took me through Blackwood and 5 miles beyond, down a county road that eventually gave way to gravel. The final mile was navigable only by a dirt track so overgrown it seemed designed to discourage visitors. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, a substantial structure of stone and timber larger than I'd expected. It looked to be at least 100 years old, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and windows like watchful eyes facing the surrounding forest. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. Despite Hargrove's assurance that the place had been maintained, a fine layer of dust covered every surface. The furniture was solid and utilitarian, heavy wooden chairs, a table built for someone who worked with their hands, shelves lined with books on botany, mycology, and folklore. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with an ancient but functional stove, and a living area dominated by a stone fireplace. But the most striking feature was the study that occupied what should have been a dining room. 3 walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. The 4th was covered entirely by a map of the property, a detailed topographical rendering with hundreds of small red pens inserted at various points. Each pen had a number that corresponded to a leather-bound journal on the shelves below. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table covered with botanical specimens, magnifying glasses, and what appeared to be scientific equipment from another ear, brass microscopes, hand-blown glass containers, and tools I couldn't identify. As daylight faded, I lit the kerosene lamps I found in the kitchen. Electricity powered the refrigerator and a few ceiling lights, but the cabin seemed designed to exist primarily by firelight and shadow. I selected one of the journals at random, number 37, and settled into a chair by the fireplace. My grandfather's handwriting was precise and small, filling the pages with observations, diagrams, and occasional personal reflections. April 17, 1983. The mycorrhizal network beneath Site C has expanded another 12 feet since winter. The transmission speed between sentinel trees has increased accordingly. What I first took for simple chemical communication appears to be something far more complex. The forest is not merely a collection of individual organisms, it is a system, perhaps even an entity. I flipped through pages of increasingly technical notes about soil samples, root structures, and fungal growth patterns. Much of it was beyond my understanding, but I gathered my grandfather had been studying how trees in his forest communicated through underground fungal networks. A passage near the end of the journal caught my attention. September 3, 1983. The dreams have begun again. Last night I stood beneath the grandfather oak, while the earth breathed beneath my feet. The voice from the soul spoke my name not as sound, but as sensation moving through my body. It knows I am listening now. It knows I understand what it wants. The entry ended there. I closed the journal, suddenly aware of how quiet the cabin had become. Outside, the forest was a wall of darkness pressed against the windows. For the first time since arriving, I felt a prickle of unease. I checked the locks on the doors and windows before turning in for the night, telling myself it was just standard precaution in an unfamiliar rural setting. But as I drifted off to sleep in my grandfather's bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the darkness outside was aware of my presence. The dreams began that very first night. I stood in a clearing I didn't recognize, though I somehow knew it was on my grandfather's property. The moonlight was too bright, turning everything silver-edged and surreal. At the center of the clearing was a circle of mushrooms, a fairy ring. My sleeping mind supplied surrounding what appeared to be a small mound of disturbed earth. As I watched, the mound pulsed as if something beneath it was breathing. The soil cracked, and from the fissures emerged tiny threads of luminescent fungi spreading outward like a web of glowing veins. A voice called my name not aloud, but as a vibration I felt in my bones. I woke with a gasp, sheets tangled around my legs and sweat cooling on my skin despite the autumn chill. Dawn light filtered through the window, revealing the ordinary bedroom of an ordinary cabin. No glowing fungi, no breathing earth, just a dream, I told myself. The product of reading strange journals before bed. I spent the morning exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin. The forest was old-growth massive oaks and maples, their trunks wider than my arm span, interspersed with younger trees and a dense understory of ferns and shrubs. Late October had turned the canopy into a kaleidoscope of red and gold, sunlight filtering through in dappled patterns. It was beautiful, but something about it felt deliberate. The distribution of trees, the way undergrowth clustered in some areas and cleared in others, it didn't have the random quality of natural forest. It felt curated, like a garden, allowed to grow wild but still guided by some underlying vision. I found a well-worn footpath leading from the cabin's back door into the woods. Following it, I discovered several small clearings with stone benches where my grandfather had presumably sat to observe his surroundings. Each clearing had a metal tag nailed to a nearby tree with a number corresponding to sections on the map in the study. In the third clearing, I found something stranger, a circle of mushrooms surrounding a small mound of earth, exactly like the one from my dream. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached it. The mushrooms were pale cream with speckled brown, capsordinary-looking fungi forming a near-perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter. The mound at the center was subtle, no more than a few inches high. I knelt beside it, half expecting to see glowing threads emerging from the soil. Nothing happened. It was just earth and fungi, common elements of any forest floor. And yet, something felt wrong. The air in the clearing was to still, the surrounding forest to quiet. No birds called, no insects buzzed, no leaves rustled. despite the breeze I'd felt only moments before on the path. I reached out hesitantly toward the mound. The instant my fingers touched the soil, a jolt like static electricity shot up my arm. I jerked back, startled, but unhurt. That's when I noticed the mushrooms had changed. The pale cream caps had darkened to a deep russet, and tiny droplets of clear liquid beaded along their edges like sweat or tears. I told myself it was a natural reaction, some biological process triggered by vibration or body heat. But I couldn't stop myself from backing away, returning to the path with more haste than dignity. That evening, I searched through my grandfather's library for information about the mushroom species I had seen. I found it in a hand-illustrated mycology text, Lacrimaria pixidata, commonly known as weeping pixie cap, rare, but not unheard of in old-growth forests of the region. What the text didn't explain was why seeing them filled me with such inexplicable dread. I returned to the journals, this time selecting numbers that corresponded to pens near the clearing I had visited. In Journal 53, I found my grandfather's first mention of the mushroom circle. July 12, 1989. The fairy ring has appeared exactly where the network converges. The mycelium below must be ancient, decades, perhaps centuries old. The soil samples show unusual levels of electrical activity, almost like a nervous system. When I placed my hand upon the mound, I felt ... communication. Not words, but intent. It is trying to reach me. Tonight I will try reaching back. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, the handwriting noticeably more erratic. July 27, 1989. The dreams are more than dreams. The network is vast, far more past than I understood. It connects not just the trees on my property, but extends for miles in all directions. And there is a consciousness within it, ancient and patient and hungry. It has been waiting for someone who can hear it, someone it can use. The journal entries grew increasingly disjointed after that. My grandfather described dreams where he walked through the forest while the trees whispered his name. He wrote about feeling roots growing beneath his skin, fungi blooming in his lungs. He became obsessed with a clearing at the center of his property, the heart of the network. He called it where he claimed the forest itself had begun to take physical form. The final entry in Journal 53, dated November 1st, 1989, contained only one sentence. It wants me to plant her there, my grandmother. I thought back to what Hargrove had said about my grandfather becoming reclusive after his wife died. But according to the dates in the journal, my grandmother wouldn't die for another 5 years, unless the official record was wrong. Sleep evaded me that night. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, the creak of branches, the soft whisper of leaves, and occasionally a sound like something heavy dragging across the ground outside. When I finally drifted off near dawn, the dreams returned. This time I stood at the edge of a larger clearing deep in the forest. At its center grew an enormous oak tree, its bark twisted into patterns that resembled a human face in profile. At the base of the tree was a hollow filled with rich black soil. Something moved within the soul-pale tendrils that reached up like fingers before retreating. The voice in my bones was stronger now, more insistent. It spoke not just my name, but words I almost understood, concepts that hovered just beyond comprehension. I woke to find myself standing in the study, hands pressed against the property map. fingers resting on a pen I hadn't examined before. Number 77, located at what appeared to be the very center of Marshall's Ocker, the heart of the network. I spent the day in town, partly to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin, but mostly to learn what I could about my grandfather from the locals. The diner on Main Street seemed the best place to start in small towns. Waitresses often knew everyone's business. The woman who served my coffee was in her 60s with hair dyed an improbable shade of auburn and a name tag that read Dottie. When I mentioned I was Elijah, Marshall's grandson, her smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, the professor," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He didn't come to town much, especially in his later years. Did you know him well?" "Nobody knew him well, honey." She refilled my coffee without being asked. "He was already a strange one when he moved here in the 70s. After your grandmother disappeared, he got downright reclusive." "Disappeared," I repeated, a chill running through me despite the diner's warmth. "I was told she'd die." Dottie glanced around, then lowered her voice. "That's the official story. Heart attack. Buried in the cemetery over in Coopersville. But folks around here know she never left that forest." She tapped her temple. "At least not walking out on her own." My appetite vanished. "What do you mean?" "Just rumors, mind you. But your grandfather changed after she went missing. Stopped teaching at the university. Holed up in that cabin. People who went out there said he talked to the trees like they were people." She straightened up. "Course, grief does strange things to a person." I paid for my untouched meal and walked through town, my mind racing. At the local library, a single room attached to the town hall, I requested newspapers from the period when my grandmother would have died. The librarian, a young woman with an obvious fascination for local history, helped me search the archives. "The Marshall case," she said with barely concealed excitement. "One of Blackwood's great mysteries." The newspaper articles told a different story than Hargrove's neat narrative. My grandmother, Eleanor Marshall, was reported missing in April 1994. The official search lasted 2 weeks before being called off due to hazardous conditions in the forest. A month later, a small item announced that Eleanor Marshall had been found deceased from natural causes, with a private burial arranged by her husband. No mention of where the body was found, no details about the cause of death. Just a tidy conclusion to an inconvenient mystery. The weird thing, the librarian confided, is that the search team reported strange conditions in the forest near the Marshall property. Disorientation, equipment failures. One guy even claimed the trees moved when they weren't looking. The county sheriff shut down that kind of talk pretty quick. "And my grandfather?" I asked. "Did anyone suspect him?" She shook her head. "Not officially. He had an alibi. He was giving a lecture at the university the day she disappeared. But people talked, you know, especially after he became so reclusive." That night back at the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about Journal Entry 53. It wants me to plant her there. I pulled out the property map and located Pin 77, the heart of the network. According to the map, it was nearly 2 miles from the cabin in the deepest part of the forest. If I wanted answers, that's where I needed to go. But not at night, not when the dreams felt so real and my grip on reality already seemed tenuous. I waited until morning, packing a backpack with water, food, a first aid kit, and a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon if needed. I also took my phone, though I had no illusions about having service. The path to the center of the property was clear at first, following the same trail I'd taken the day before. But a mile in, it began to fade, becoming little more than a game trail winding between massive trees. The forest grew denser as I progressed, the canopy closing over it until only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The undergrowth changed to fewer ferns and shrubs, more fungi of varieties I'd never seen before. Mushrooms in impossible colors grew from fallen logs, and shelf fungi formed grotesque faces on tree trunks. I checked my compass frequently, but something strange was happening. The needle spun erratically, sometimes pointing in completely opposite directions from one moment to the next. I resorted to using the sun's position to maintain my heading, but even that became difficult as the canopy thickened. The air grew increasingly still and heavy, moisture beating on my skin, not from exertion, but from the oppressive humidity that seemed to intensify with every step. The forest sounds changed to no birds, no scurrying small animals, just the occasional deep groan of wood under stress. Like the forest itself was shifting around me, I found myself walking in circles more than once, returning to landmarks I'd passed 30 minutes earlier despite maintaining what I believe was a straight path. It was as if the forest itself was redirecting me, subtly altering my perception of direction. After what felt like hours, but according to my watch was only 90 minutes, I stumbled upon another mushroom circle larger than the first, perhaps 15 feet in diameter. The fungi were different, here black caps with stems that twisted like fingers. The mound they surrounded was more pronounced, nearly a foot high at its center. Something about it made me deeply uneasy, but I forced myself to approach. I needed to understand what had happened to my grandmother, what my grandfather had been studying all those years. As I stepped into the circle, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath clouded before me despite the October day being relatively mild. The silence deepened until I could hear my own heartbeat. I knelt beside the mound, removing my glove to touch the soil as my grandfather had described. The jolt was immediate and powerful, not like static electricity this time, but like plunging my hand into an electrical current. I tried to pull away, but couldn't. My muscles contracted involuntarily, my vision blurred, and I felt myself falling forward onto the mound. When my face pressed against the cool earth, the forest spoke to me, not in words, but in images that flooded my mind with terrifying clarity. Root systems spreading like neural networks beneath the soil. Trees communicated through chemical signals carried by fungal threads. A consciousness that had developed over centuries, gradually awakening as the network grew more complex. And hunger, a desperate need to expand, to connect, to consume. I saw my grandfather standing in this very spot decades earlier, his hand pressed to the soul, his face alight with the same terrible understanding now coursing through me. I saw him return to the cabin and look at his wife with new eyes, not as a beloved companion, but as a resource, raw material for the network's growth. I saw him lead her into the forest one morning, to this circle of mushrooms. I saw her face as she realized what was happening, the betrayal, the fear. I saw him hold her down as thread-like fungi emerged, from the mound and wrap around her limbs, pulling her slowly into the earth. I saw other bodies, two hikers who'd strayed too far from marked trails, a forest ranger who'd come looking for them, a local teenager who'd made the mistake of camping in Marshall's Acre, all of them now part of the network, their nutrients feeding the ancient consciousness beneath the soul. With a supreme effort of will, I tore my hand away from the mound and scrambled backward, out of the mushroom circle. The connection broke, leaving me gasping and trembling on the forest floor. I had to get out, had to get back to the cabin, to my car, to civilization. But as I stood on shaking legs, I realized the forest had changed again. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth thicker. The path I'd followed was nowhere to be seen. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to breathe, to think. The sun was still visible in patches through the canopy. If I could maintain a straight line in any direction, I'd eventually reach the edge of the 40 acres. I began walking, pushing through underbrush that seemed to clutch at my clothing, ducking under branches that hadn't been there moments before. The forest was actively working to confuse me, to keep me within its bounds. Hours passed. The sun moved overhead and began its descent. I should have reached the property line long ago, but the trees stretched endlessly in every direction as dusk approached, bringing with it the first hints of fog rising from the forest floor. I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins, a voice, distant but distinct, calling my name. It wasn't the bone-deep vibration from my dreams, but an actual human voice, a woman's voice with a lilt that somehow felt familiar despite never having heard it before. "James," it called again, closer now. "James, I've been waiting for you." Through the gathering mist, I saw a figure moving between the trees, the silhouette of a woman in a dress that might once have been white but was now stained with soil and what looked like moss. She emerged into a shaft of fading sunlight, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. Gaunt, the skin like yellowed parchment stretched over bone, but recognizable from the photos I'd seen in the cabin. My grandmother, Eleanor Marshall, just as she'd looked 30 years ago when she disappeared, but wrung her movements to fluid, her eyes to bright, her smile revealing teeth that seemed to have grown longer, sharper. "Your grandfather promised you would come," she said, her voice buzzing with unnatural harmonics. "He told us about you before he joined us, the artist, the one who could bring us into the world beyond the forest." I backed away, my heel catching on a root. I stumbled but kept my feet. "Stay away from me," I warned, my voice breaking with terror. She cocked her head at an impossible angle, her neck bending nearly 90 degrees. "But you're already one of us, James. You touch the heart," you heard the voice. "The mycelium is already inside you, connecting you to the network." As she spoke, I became aware of a strange sensation beneath my skin, a subtle movement, like threads shifting just below the surface. I looked down at my hands and saw fine white lines tracing the paths of my veins, glowing faintly in the gathering darkness. "No," I whispered, but I knew she was right. Since touching the mound, something had changed within me. I could feel the forest now, not as a separate entity, but as an extension of myself, or myself as an extension of it. "Your grandfather resisted, too, at first," said the thing wearing my grandmother's face. "But he came to understand we are the future not just of this forest, but of all life. The network spans continents, James. It has existed for millennia, evolving, expanding, waiting for minds that could help it grow further. What do you want from me? I asked, though I feared I already knew. The same thing we wanted from Elijah, to be our emissary to the world of men, to bring others to the heart. Her smile widened until it split her face nearly in half. You've seen our dreams, imagined what we could create together. The fog thickened around us, shapes moving within it that were neither human nor tree, but some grotesque hybrid of both. The forest was showing me its true nature, how not just a network of plants and fungi, but a single vast organism with a consciousness that had evolved over centuries. And it was hungry. Take me to the heart, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. I want to understand. The thing that had been my grandmother smiled, her face stretching in ways human faces should not. Follow me, grandson. She turned and moved deeper into the forest, her movements more glide than walk. I followed not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see the center of this, or the place where my grandfather had sacrificed his humanity for knowledge, the heart of the network. Night fell completely as we walked, but I didn't need light to see. The fungi beneath my skin glowed faintly, illuminating the path ahead. Other lights moved through the forest, people-shaped figures that glimmered with the same internal luminescence, watching our passage with faceless curiosity. The others, my grandmother's voice explained, though her mouth didn't move. Those who came before, those who joined willingly or otherwise. I recognized some of them from the missing persons reports I'd seen in the Blackwood Library archives of Forest Ranger, a pair of hikers, locals who had vanished over the decades. Their forms were indistinct, more suggestion than substance, but their awareness was unmistakable. They observed me with hungry interest. We walked for what seemed like hours, but could have been minutes. Time had become as fluid as space in this place. Eventually, we reached a clearing larger than any I'd seen before, dominated by an enormous oak tree that must have been centuries old. Its trunk was wider than a car, its bark twisted into formations that resembled faces in profile, hundreds of them, screaming silently. The massive roots broke the surface of the ground, creating a tangled lattice before plunging back into the earth. Between those roots was a depression filled with rich black soil that seemed to move with a rhythm like breathing. From it rose a sweetish scent of decay and renewed the smell of a forest floor in spring, but intensified to the point of nausea. The heart, my not-grandmother said, gesturing to the depression, where we truly become one with the network. Standing before the ancient oak, I felt the full weight of what my grandfather had discovered and what it had cost him. The network wasn't just a biological curiosity. It was an entity that had achieved a form of consciousness, one that had recognized in humans the potential to expand beyond its natural limitations. Where is he? I asked my grandfather. Everywhere, she replied, her voice echoing from multiple directions at once. His body nourishes the soil, his mind enriches the network. Just as mine does, just as yours will. As she spoke, the soil and the depression began to move more vigorously, forming a mound that rose up like a small hill. From its surface emerged what at first appeared to be roots, but revealed themselves to be fingers-long, wooden digits that reached toward me with deliberate intent. It's time, James, my grandmother's voice said from behind me. Time to join the family. I felt hands on my back, not just hers, With many hands, the forest's other victims pushing me toward the waiting earth. The fungi under my skin pulsed in response, urging me forward. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to surrender to it, to become one with the vast consciousness that permeated the forest. But another part, the part that was still human, still me, rebelled against the horror of it. I remembered the journals in the cabin, my grandfather's descent into madness or revelation. I thought of the map with its hundreds of pins marking sites throughout the property, and I recalled one particular entry. Fire is the only thing it fears. With the last of my human wool, I reached into my pocket and removed the lighter I had brought to start a campfire if needed. The forest sensed my intention. Immediately the hands on my back became more insistent, the wooden fingers from the mound reaching higher. "You can't destroy us," my grandmother's voice hissed, no longer bothering to maintain its human quality. "We are too vast, too deeply rooted. I don't need to destroy all of you," I said, thumbing the lighter to life, "just enough of you to escape." I touched the flame to my own arm, where the fungal threads glowed beneath my skin. The fire caught with unnatural speed, feeding on whatever the network had placed inside me. The pain was excruciating. But brief, the fungi burned like gasoline, consuming themselves rather than my flesh. Around me, the forest screamed, not just the shapes of the formerly human, but the trees themselves, their branches thrashing in agony, the connection I'd felt too. The network severed abruptly, leaving me fully myself again. In the confusion, I ran not away from the heart but toward it. I plunged the lighter directly into the breathing soil of the depression, where the concentration of fungi would be greatest. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The mound erupted in blue-white flames that spread along invisible lines beneath the soil, the mycorrhizal network itself catching fire, carrying the destruction outward in all directions. The not-grandmother thing clutched at me with hands that were rapidly reverting to wood and soil. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her face collapsing into compost. I didn't stay to watch. I ran blindly through the burning forest, following the path of destruction my action had created. The network was burning from within, and in its death throes. It had lost control of the forest it had manipulated for so long. Trees fell around me, not deliberately trying to block my path now, but simply collapsing as their support systems failed. The ghostly figures of the network's victims flickered and dissipated like fog in strong sunlight. I ran until I could no longer see the unnatural fire behind me, until the trees thinned and became normal forest again, until I stumbled onto a gravel road that I eventually recognized as the county road that led back to town. Epilogue: the forest fire was contained before it spread beyond Marshall's Auger. The official explanation cited lightning strike, though there had been no storm that night. I didn't correct them. Who would believe the truth? I inherited nothing but ash and the charred remains of a cabin filled with the ravings of a man who had sacrificed everything: his wife, his morality, ultimately himself, to a consciousness that had evolved in the dark places beneath the forest floor. Sometimes in my dreams I still hear the voice in my bones calling me back. Sometimes I catch myself examining the veins in my wrists, looking for the faint white threads that once grew there. And sometimes, when walking through city parks or past planters on the sidewalk, I think I see mushrooms turning to follow my passage, their caps quivering, slightly as if in recognition the fire destroyed the heart of the network. But I know the truth now. The network is never truly gone. It's ancient and patient and spans continents. What I encountered was just one node of something far larger and older than humanity itself. It's waiting beneath the soil of every forest, growing, connecting, becoming, and it remembers me. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after the fireplane white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single dried mushroom cap and a note in handwriting I recognized from the journals. You can burn the heart, but you can't destroy the body. It's in you now, it's in all of us. The handwriting was my grandfather's. The letter was postmarked 2 days earlier. That should have been my first warning, but after 3 hours of hiking the well-documented paths of Blackwater State Forest, I was craving something different, something untouched. So when I spotted the narrow opening between 2 ancient oaks, barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness, I didn't hesitate. A fallen log served as a natural threshold, and as I stepped over it, the forest changed. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious that I could immediately identify the difference, but the quality of the silence shifted. The distant calls of birds ceased, the rustling of leaves faded. Even the sound of my boots on the forest floor seemed muffled, as if absorbed by the moss and soil rather than reflected back. The trail itself was just a suggestion, a slightly less overgrown path winding between trees that seemed older and larger than those in the rest of the forest. Their trunks were massive, bark blackened with age, branches reaching so high they created a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in weak, scattered beams that did little to dispel the perpetual twilight below. I checked my phone, no reception, as expected this deep in the woods. The GPS still worked, though, tracking my position relative to the main trail I'd left behind. According to the screen, I was only a quarter-mile from where I'd started. Easy enough to find my way back when needed. The path descended gradually into a shallow valley I hadn't noticed from the main trail. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like they had grown around things that were no longer there. In places, 2 or 3 trees had fused at the base, creating natural archways over the path. A fine mist hung in the air, not thick enough to obscure vision, but sufficient to lend everything a dreamlike quality. Droplets collected on my jacket and hair, each one catching what little light penetrated the canopy and refracting it into tiny prisms. I'd hiked about half a mile when I first heard that my name, spoken softly from somewhere in the trees to my right. Aden, I stopped, turning toward the sound. Nothing but trees and undergrowth, shadows and mist. Hello? My voice sounded flat, lacking the echo I would expect in a forest. No response. Just the subtle drip of moisture from leaves and the distant sound of moving water. I continued walking, attributing the voice to imagination or the wind playing tricks. A few minutes later, it came again, closer this time, just behind my left shoulder. Aden. I spun around, heart pounding again. Nothing. But the trail behind me looked different, narrower, the trees closer together. Had they been that way before? Who's there? I called, my voice stronger now, with an edge of irritation masking the first flickers of fear. The forest absorbed my question without answer. I considered turning back, but found myself oddly reluctant. I'd come this far, the path had to lead somewhere, and my GPS still showed the main trail was easily reachable. Barely half a mile away now, I pressed on. The valley deepened. The trail wound between massive boulders, covered with moss so thick it resembled green velvet. In places, the rocks formed narrow passages where I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The air grew colder, damper. I emerged from one such passage into a small clearing and stopped short. At its center stood a single tree, an oak so massive it dwarfed even the giants I'd passed earlier. Its trunk must have been 15 feet in diameter, bark deeply furrowed and blackened as if by ancient fire. What caught my attention, though, were the objects hanging from its lower branches. Backpacks, dozens of them, in various states of decay. Some were relatively new, modern nylon and bright colors, while others were little more than rotted fragments of canvas and leather. They hung at different heights, swaying slightly despite the absence of any perceptible breeze. Below them, arranged in a rough semicircle, were hiking boots. Pairs of them neatly placed side by side as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I approached cautiously, drawn by horrified curiosity. The nearest backpack was a faded red, its fabric sun-bleached and water-stained, but still intact. A small luggage tag hung from one strap. I reached out and turned it over. The name was still legible, Mark Santiago. The date on the tag was October 17th, 1998. 27 years ago, I backed away, suddenly eager to leave this place. As I turned toward the path I'd entered by, my name came again, but this time I recognized the voice. Aden, my sister, Emily, who had been missing for 3 years. Aden, help me. Her voice came from beyond the great oak, where the path continued into deeper woods. It had the same cadence, the same slight catch on the second syllable of my name that had been uniquely hers. Emily, my voice cracked. Emily, where are you? Follow my voice, she replied, more distant now. I'm trapped. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that my sister couldn't possibly be here, that this was some kind of trick. But the voice was unmistakably hers, and if there was even the slightest chance, I circled the ancient oak, careful not to touch any of the hanging backpacks, and continued along the path. It narrowed again, descending more steeply now. The mist thickened into proper fog, limiting visibility to a few yards ahead. Aden, hurry. Emily's voice was urgent now, tinged with fear. It's coming back. What's coming back? I called, moving faster despite the treacherous footing. Emily, what happened to you? The forest, she answered, her voice breaking. The forest took me, like it took the others. I broke into a jog, then a full run, heedless of the roots and rocks that threatened to trip me. My sister needed me. After 3 years of searching, of police investigations that led nowhere, of my parents' quiet descent into grief-stricken resignation, I'd found her. The path ended abruptly at a sheer rock face, perhaps 30 feet high. Water trickled down its moss-covered surface, collecting in a small, perfectly circular pool at its base. The water was absolutely still its surface like black glass, reflecting the gray sky visible and the small opening far above. Emily's voice came from the pool. "Hey, Dan, I'm down here." I fell to my knees at the edge of the water, peering into its depths. For a moment I saw nothing but darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I made out a face just below the surface veil, familiar, with the same green eyes as mine. Emily, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared on her solo hiking trip 3 years ago. "Emily," I plunged my hands into the water, trying to reach her. The pool was ice cold, numbing my skin instantly, and deep, far deeper than its small circumference suggested. My arms went into the shoulders without touching bottom. Emily's face remained just out of reach, looking up at me with an expression of profound sadness. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice somehow perfectly clear despite coming from underwater. "Now it has you too." "What do you mean?" I tried to stand, to pull back from the pool, but found I couldn't move. My knees seemed fused to the ground, my hands frozen in the water. "Emily, what's happening?" Her expression changed, then subtly at first, then dramatically. Her sad smile widened, stretching beyond what a human face should allow. Her eyes darkened, pupils expanding until no white remained. "The forest needs voices," she said, but it wasn't Emily's voice anymore. It was deeper, layered, as if multiple people spoke in imperfect unison. Fresh voices to call the next ones. Horror washed over me as understanding dawned. The backpacks, the boots, the voices calling my name. Not Emily, never Emily. Something seized my wrists beneath the water-knot hands, but something that felt like roots, woody tendrils wrapping around my arms with surprising strength. They began to pull, drawing me toward the surface of the pool. I fought desperately, trying to wrench free, but my body felt leaden, unresponsive. The roots pulled harder. My face touched the water, which was no longer cold but warm, almost inviting. As my head submerged, I saw then dozens of faces suspended in the impossible depths, each one looking up with the same black eyes that had replaced my sister's. Some were recent, their features still distinctly human. Others had begun to change, skin taking on the texture of bark, hair becoming like fine, weaving roots. They watched impassively as I was drawn deeper, no longer struggling now, my lungs burning for air that part of me no longer seemed to need. The last thing I remembered was a chorus of voices, all those lost in the forest, speaking together. "Welcome to Echo Trail. Someone will be along soon." 3 hikers found my backpack 2 days later, hanging from the lowest branch of an ordinary oak just 10 feet from the main path. My boots stood neatly beneath it, as if I had simply stepped out of them and walked away. They reported it to the park rangers, who organized a search. They found nothing else, not the narrow trail between ancient oaks, not the valley with its massive trees, not the clearing with its collection of abandoned gear. But sometimes hikers in Blackwater State Forest report hearing a voice, my voice, calling their name from somewhere deep among the trees, guiding them toward a trail that isn't on any map, a trail where the forest echoes with the voices of those it has taken, a trail you can find but never leave.